The night was dark, and a cold wind howled through the streets of London, making the torches flicker and dance. Inside the Tower of London, King Edward III stood by the stone window, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city. His heart was heavy with loss and worry. Just a few weeks ago, his beloved brother, John of Eltham, had been laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. Now, as he gazed out into the night, he couldn't shake off the feeling that more trouble was on the horizon. The room behind him was filled with the quiet murmurs of his closest advisors. But Edward's mind was elsewhere. He thought about the French, who had already attacked Gascony, and were now threatening to seize the entire Duchy of Aquitaine. He thought about the rebels in Scotland, who were causing chaos and making it nearly impossible to rebuild Bothwell Castle. And he thought about the sickness that had claimed the life of his newborn son, William of Hatfield, just weeks after his birth. Edward's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps. His wife, Queen Philippa, entered the room, her face pale but determined. She had just returned from Hatfield, where she had been staying during her pregnancy. "My lord," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the kingdom needs you now more than ever. You cannot let these troubles consume you." Edward turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination. "You are right, my love," he said, taking her hand. "But the weight of all this is almost too much to bear." Philippa squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with a fierce resolve. "We have faced challenges before, and we will face them again. Together we can overcome anything." With a deep breath, Edward nodded. He knew she was right. He had to be strong, not just for himself, but for his kingdom. He turned back to his advisors, who had fallen silent, waiting for his decision. "Prepare the fleet," Edward commanded, his voice firm. "We must protect our merchants heading to Gascony, and send word to Bayonne and Dartmouth to strengthen their defenses. We cannot let the French think we are weak." The advisors nodded, and one by one, they left the room to carry out their orders. Edward and Philippa stood together, looking out into the night. The sounds of the city below seemed distant, almost irrelevant, as they faced the challenges ahead. But Edward's mind was already racing forward. He had a plan, a way to turn the tide of fortune in his favor. He would need the support of his council, his parliament, and the people of England. But he was determined to show the world that he was not a king to be underestimated. The next morning, Edward gathered his council in the Tower of London. The room was filled with the country's most powerful men, their faces tense with concern. Edward stood before them, his voice steady and clear. "My lords, the threats we face are real, and they are many, but we cannot be divided. We must stand together as one to protect our kingdom and our people." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I propose that we reinforce our fleet and build a league of allies against the French, just as my grandfather, Edward I, did in 1297. We will also ban the export of unworked wool, encouraging weavers to come to England and teach our people their craft. This will strengthen our economy and make us less dependent on foreign trade." The council members exchanged looks, some nodding in agreement, others skeptical. But Edward was not finished. "Furthermore, I will create a new title of nobility, the Duke of Cornwall, and bestow it upon my son, Edward. This will honor him and bind him to the people of England, just as the title of Prince of Wales did for my grandfather." The room fell silent, the weight of Edward's words hanging in the air. It was a bold move, one that would send a clear message to both the French and the Scots. Edward was not just a king, he was a leader ready to take on any challenge. As the council began to discuss his proposals, Edward knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But he was determined to lead his kingdom through the storm. The glories of war had turned into the bitter realities of diplomacy, but Edward was ready to reclaim his destiny. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the tower, a new resolve was taking hold. The king and his queen stood together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The night was dark, but the light of determination burned bright in their hearts. On March 13th, 1337, the English Parliament was buzzing with excitement. The day's highlight was not a new law, nor a deal about wool, nor the creation of a new duke. Instead, King Edward III made a grand move by creating 6 new earls. This was a big deal because it showed that the king wasn't just favoring one person over others. He was recognizing the hard work and loyalty of several men. First, there was Sir William Montagu, who became the Earl of Salisbury. He was Edward's closest friend and had helped capture the evil Mortimer, who had once controlled the kingdom. Next was Henry of Grosmont, the son of the Duke of Lancaster, who became the Earl of Derby. William Bohun, another hero in the fight against Mortimer, became the Earl of Northampton. Hugh Audley, despite being Mortimer's nephew, had joined the rebellion against him and became the Earl of Gloucester. William Clinton, who had also helped capture Mortimer, became the Earl of Huntingdon. Lastly, Robert Ufford, the oldest of the new earls, became the Earl of Suffolk. All these men had played a crucial role in helping Edward take back control of the kingdom from Mortimer. By making them earls, Edward was showing his gratitude and ensuring that no one would accuse him of favoritism. The end of the Parliament was marked by a huge feast. The king spent a fortune on the meal, enough to pay over 100 skilled workers for a whole year. Edward and Queen Philippa held separate courts for the men and women, and 20 men were knighted to celebrate the occasion. Lord Berkeley was even cleared of any wrongdoing against the previous king, Edward II. Despite the festive atmosphere, there were serious problems looming. The Scots were planning to attack Stirling Castle, and the French king Philip was making moves to take over the entire Duchy of Aquitaine. But Edward was a king who faced his problems head-on. He was determined to protect his kingdom and its interests. After the Parliament, Edward launched a flurry of diplomatic efforts. He sent letters to the Pope, the King of Castile, and various counts and dukes across Europe. He also sent representatives to negotiate with the Flemish towns of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres to allow them to buy English wool. He requested warships from the Gascon port of Bayonne and prepared a defense strategy for Gascony. Even as the French were attacking English ports, Edward was still trying to find a peaceful solution. Edward's representatives, led by Henry Burghersh, William Montagu, and William Clinton, met with Philip's representatives in Valenciennes in early May. The battle lines were clear. Louis, Count of Flanders, and John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, supported Philip. On Edward's side were the Count of Hainault, the Count of Gelderland, the Duke of Brabant, and other minor counts and margraves. The talks turned to war, and Edward offered to pay handsomely for their support. Edward remained in Westminster until May 3rd, then raced north with his army to Stirling Castle, where the Scots were besieging the fortress. But the Scots, knowing that Edward was on his way, retreated into hiding. They waited until he left before attacking again, using supplies from the French through Dunbar. While Edward was at Stirling, Philip made a decisive move. On May 24th, he confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine. This was a clear challenge to Edward, who saw it as a declaration of war. Edward returned to the south and began planning his response. He expanded his coalition, offering alliances and financial support to various European leaders, including the Holy Roman Emperor, Ludwig of Bavaria. The Pope, Benedict XII, tried to prevent the war but to no avail. In July, Edward held another council to discuss the French invasion of Gascony. Philip's actions were causing Gascon families to withdraw their support for Edward. The king decided not to send a large army directly to Aquitaine, as it would leave England vulnerable. Instead, he sent a small force under John of Norwich to defend the duchy and kept a larger army in England, ready to join his allies in the Low Countries and attack northern France. Edward also used his control over English wool as a strategic tool. He had withheld wool from export for a year, and now he directed it to the looms of his allies in Brabant while cutting off the Count of Flanders. This move enriched his friends and impoverished his enemies, and he used the wool trade to borrow large sums of money. The initial hostilities were not intense. Philip's army invaded the Agenais in July, but Edward's small force was still in Portsmouth. The French attacked a few fortified towns, but they held out. Philip was more concerned about Edward's larger plan to attack northern France with his allies. In late August, Edward secured the support of the Holy Roman Emperor Ludwig by promising a large sum of money. Edward was showing that he was a skilled diplomat and a capable strategist. He was taking the initiative and not just reacting to Philip's actions. In September, Edward called a parliament to discuss the wars with Scotland and France. The Parliament made a historic decision by granting Edward taxes for the next 3 years, showing strong support for his leadership. Edward had made sure to keep the people informed about the dangers of French aggression, and had consulted with leading men across the country. The result was that Parliament agreed to let Edward lead the military alliance in the Low Countries and meet with the Holy Roman Emperor. Edward was ready to face the challenges ahead, and his kingdom was behind him. In the late autumn of 1337, King Edward III of England found himself at a critical juncture. On the surface, it seemed that everything was going according to plan. He was about to lead a grand alliance against King Philip VI of France, who was known for his indecisiveness and reluctance to take financial risks. Edward had gathered a powerful array of allies from across Europe, ready to strike. However, beneath this facade of readiness, Edward faced significant challenges. Firstly, his financial situation was dire. The 3 years of taxation he had imposed would not even cover the debts he had already accumulated, let alone the costs of his upcoming campaign. He had borrowed heavily from Italian merchants and the wool company of Conduit and de la Pole, but the money was not enough. To make matters worse, he had promised more than he could deliver to his allies, and he was now dependent on them keeping their promises. He had also committed to providing troops he did not have, as he needed to keep forces in the north to defend against the Scots, in Aquitaine to hold French territory, and along the southern coast to protect England. Edward's advisors were worried. They cautioned him that the grand expedition might have to be cancelled. But Edward, known for his diplomatic skills, did not cancel. He postponed. This gave King Philip an opening to propose peace negotiations. Edward, eager to maintain momentum, agreed to negotiate but upped the stakes by threatening to claim the French throne. On October 6, 1337, he issued writs appointing several of his allies as his lieutenants in France, using the titles King of France and England and King of England and France interchangeably. This bold move was a direct challenge to Philip and an insult to the Pope, who saw Edward's claim as a potential source of instability in Europe. The Pope, Benedict XII, sent 2 cardinals to England to dissuade Edward from crossing the Channel. The Pope feared that once Edward was in France, he would be more likely to go to war. Despite this, Edward pressed on. In early November, the Pope wrote to Philip, warning him of Edward's alliances with German and Low Country rulers. The Pope outlined how Edward planned to bribe Ludwig of Bavaria to resign as Holy Roman Emperor, so that Edward could be elected in his place. Even if Ludwig did not resign, Edward aimed to be appointed Vicar of Lower Germany, bringing him closer to France and making it easier to attack. The Pope emphasized that Philip was almost completely isolated and advised him to seek peace. Meanwhile, Edward continued to face difficulties in gathering men and money. His allies were becoming restless, and the cardinals sent by the Pope were urging him to agree to a truce. To show his resolve, Edward ordered Sir Walter Manny to lead a fleet and harass French ships. Manny's fleet won a bloody victory at Cadiz, but this did not solve Edward's problems. He was still short of men and money, and his financial situation worsened when Bishop Burghersh, in a desperate attempt to secure allies, made unrealistic promises of cash. Burghersh even seized wool from Conduit and de la Pole, but his efforts to raise more money failed. Despite these challenges, Edward maintained his regal lifestyle. He paid Sir Walter Manny a large sum for a single prisoner, and ordered lavish entertainments for his court. For Christmas 1337, he created an artificial forest with gold and silver leaves and masks. For his games at Havering, he built mock siege engines and provided new clothes for the participants. His own clothes were adorned with intricate designs made of pearls and gold, showcasing his wealth and power. In dealing with the cardinals, Edward claimed that any truce with France would need parliamentary approval. The cardinals were skeptical, but this was a significant development in English governance. Edward had started involving Parliament in decisions about war and peace, a practice that had begun in 1331. By 1338, commoners were regularly summoned to Parliament, where they could present petitions and have their voices heard. This was a form of bargaining between the king and the people, with the king offering more power to the commoners in exchange for their support and money. In February 1338, Parliament was asked to support Edward's policies, including his alliances and plans to go overseas. Parliament backed Edward wholeheartedly, urging him to lead the Allied army against France. The truce was extended until midsummer, but on the same day, orders were given for the northern and southern fleets to assemble, ready to set out in May. Edward sent Bishop Burghersh to France with a message stating his intention to conquer his inheritance by force of arm. Philip was addressed as "he who calls himself King of France," and Edward declared his right to the French throne. However, there were many delays. The fleet was difficult to gather, and corruption among royal officials made it worse. Edward's haste added to the problem, as men stole supplies and sold them for their own profit. Edward himself contributed to the inefficiencies by making a rapid journey to Scotland in March, traveling from London to Berwick and back in less than 19 days. During this trip, he visited garrisons and commanders in Scottish castles, including Dunbar Castle, which was being held by the formidable Black Agnes. Despite threats to her brother, Black Agnes remained defiant, and Edward realized he needed to call off the siege to focus on his campaign in France. Edward's journey to Scotland and his continued financial and logistical challenges highlighted the complexity of his position. He was a king with grand ambitions, but he was also a man who had to navigate the practicalities of war, diplomacy, and governance. As he prepared to set out for France, Edward faced a daunting task, but he was determined to see his plans through. Edward and his royal household, including his wife Philippa, their daughters, and a large number of soldiers, finally set sail from Orwell on July 16, 1338. The journey had been delayed for weeks, and the ships were decked out with streamers and flags showing the royal arms and those of saints like Edward, Edmund, and George. The largest streamer, 75 feet long, adorned the mainmast of Edward's great ship, the Thomas, and depicted the life of St. Thomas. When the royal entourage arrived in Antwerp, they were met with a warm welcome. However, their first night in Brabant was anything but comfortable. The building they were staying in caught fire, and Edward, Philippa, and their household had to flee in their nightshirts. They found refuge at the nearby Abbey of St. Bernard. The fire was a bad omen, but things got worse. Edward's allies were hesitant to join him in the fight against France. They wanted to see the gold he had promised before committing to the war. Edward, who was used to giving gifts without checking his finances, realized he had a problem. He had very little gold to offer. To raise money, Edward turned to Italian bankers like the Bardi and Peruzzi, who lent him a total of £16,000. Paul de Montefiore, an Italian administrator and Edward's trusted friend, raised another £8,000. William de la Pole lent a much larger sum, and Sir Bartholomew Burghersh, the brother of the Bishop of Lincoln, helped raise loans from both English and continental magnates. The king even mortgaged royal treasures, including his great crown of gold, to secure more funds. Back in England, the government even allowed the clergy in Devon to dig for buried treasure, though no significant finds were reported. Despite these efforts, Edward still faced financial challenges. The Holy Roman Emperor, Ludwig, began to doubt Edward's ability to pay for his support. Edward decided to act quickly. He met with his hesitant allies, paid them small sums, and then moved his essential entourage down the Rhine to Cologne. There, he made generous donations to the city's religious institutions, including a large sum to the cathedral. This show of wealth and generosity forced Ludwig's hand. On September 5th, Edward met Ludwig in Koblenz and was crowned Vicar of the Holy Roman Empire, a title that gave him significant authority in the region. The next day, Edward traveled back to Antwerp, where he summoned his new subjects to hear the imperial letters. The town hall was decorated with fine cloths, and Edward sat 5 feet higher than everyone else, wearing his new golden crown. He read out the letters that appointed him as the emperor's lieutenant, and all present were required to swear fealty to him. Edward's war against France was now considered an imperial war. On September 6th, just after his coronation, Edward had a significant meeting. A man named William Le Gales, who claimed to be Edward II, his father, arrived in Koblenz. Edward II, who had been believed dead for 11 years, had been living in secret. Edward had arranged for William Le Gales to be brought to him by Francesco Forzetti, a trusted royal servant. The meeting was emotional for both men, and Forzetti was paid to look after Edward II for 3 weeks in December. The following December, Edward II met his grandchildren for the first time. Philippa had given birth to a son, Lionel, on November 29, 1338. Edward was overjoyed and rewarded the messenger who brought him the news with £100. The name Lionel, with its Arthurian associations, was likely chosen to honor his father and the family's history. After this meeting, Edward II's fate becomes less clear. He may have stayed with his son for Christmas and the churching of Philippa. By February, Nicolanus Fieschi, who had been involved in Edward II's secret life, left Antwerp. Francesco Forzetti reappeared in England in October 1340, dealing with the Italian wool business. Edward II probably lived out his days in peace, but his exact whereabouts remain unknown. Meanwhile, Edward's actions in the Low Countries alarmed King Philip of France. Philip gathered his army and went to St. Denis to take the Oriflamme, a ceremonial war banner. He expected Edward to invade, but Edward was not ready. Instead, Philip sent 50 ships to attack Southampton. The French sacked the town, killed the poor, raped women, and hanged wealthy men in their own homes. They then set the town on fire. The French also captured an English wool fleet, including Edward's flagship, the Edward, and one of his largest ships, the Christopher. The sailors on these ships were thrown overboard and drowned. Despite these setbacks, Edward's determination and strategic actions in the Low Countries continued to shape the early years of the 100 Years' War. The year 1339 was a turning point for Edward, a time when his ambitions and the realities of war collided in a way that tested his resolve and leadership. Despite the strategic and economic challenges he faced, Edward remained determined to prove his right to the French throne and protect England from French aggression. When Edward crossed to Brabant, the Pope was deeply disappointed. He saw Edward's move as a threat to the delicate balance of power and feared that Edward would demand military gains from his allies, which could strain the already tense relation. The Pope, already frustrated by Edward's alliance with Ludwig, a heretic, took sides with Philip. He informed Philip of Edward's plans to attack France in May, advising caution and cautioning that the information might be misinformation. To Edward, the Pope was blunt, reminding him of Ludwig's excommunication and urging him to break ties with the heretic. Back in England, the situation was dire. 3 years of good harvests had led to deflation, and the lack of silver in the money supply caused prices to crash. Edward's officers were impounding wool for shipment, and royal purveyors were seizing supplies for the war effort, leading to an economic crisis. The winter brought rain and cold, and soon there was neither money nor food. Edward, frustrated and angry, blamed his advisors and sacked his treasurer, Robert Wodehouse, a move that would later prove unwise. Under pressure, Edward's character began to show. He acted high-handedly, much like his father, and lashed out at those who were genuinely trying to help. His demand that all debts be paid in full, and his appropriation of various rights in England to raise money, further strained his relationship with his subjects. The Parliament at Westminster in February 1339 was worried by Edward's demands and his absence, which made it difficult for them to address their grievances. Philip, taking advantage of the Pope's advice and his own spies, invaded Aquitaine for the second time. Edward was unable to respond effectively, and his allies were reluctant to join him in a winter campaign. Faced with a strategic and moral crisis, Edward decided to take matters into his own hands. He declared that he would invade France, with or without his allies, and set down his terms for negotiation with Philip. The terms included compensation for losses, free passage, free trade, and a halt to French support for the Scots and the restoration of Gascony. When Philip refused to accept the terms, Edward wrote a lengthy letter to the Pope and the College of Cardinals, outlining his claims to the French throne and his grievances against Philip. He argued that his claim was based on the right of male offspring to inherit, a principle that, he claimed, even applied to the lineage of Jesus. The Pope, however, was unmoved and did not respond. On 20 September 1339, Edward marched into France, determined to bring Philip to battle. Some of his allies followed, but others, like Ludwig, did not. The Duke of Brabant joined him, but the Count of Hainault deserted to Philip. Edward's strategy was to force Philip into a battle, destroy as much of France as possible, and gain the glory and support he needed. He besieged Cambrai and laid waste the surrounding lands, but Philip did not engage in battle. On 14 October, Edward brought his army within a mile of the massive French army at Péronne. The situation was critical. Edward's smaller army was exposed, and his German allies were running low on supplies. The risk of a full-scale battle against a much larger force was high, and Edward had to withdraw. The German allies wanted to return home, and Edward was left with a difficult decision. Despite the setbacks, Edward remained focused on his goal. He understood that taking the fight to France was the best way to protect England from French attack. His determination and leadership during these challenging times would shape the course of the 100 Years' War, and his legacy would be remembered as a king who fought for what he believed was his right, even in the face of overwhelming odds.